Okay, well, thank you for being here tonight. This may not make sense to some of you. There's a few folks who will know what I'm talking about. But if you've ever been to Epcot at Disney World, and I probably just lost a lot of you by saying that, but if you've ever been to Epcot at Disney World, there is a ride there called Journey into Imagination. With a character named Figment that's a part of that ride. And they've got a song that is played as you ride that ride that when you get off, you can't get out of your head for the next 5.5 weeks. It's just stuck in there for 5.5 weeks and just, but the song basically says, one little spark. And that's kind of the emphasis I want you to hear in this, but the song says, one little spark of inspiration is at the heart of all creation. One little spark is at the heart of all creation. Right at the start of everything that's new, one little spark lights up for you. What's the point? The point is that everything new that you might want to start, every journey that you might want to start in life or endeavor you take, it may just start with one little spark. Little sparks can have a big impact, can't they? I mean, you just think it's a little spark, no big deal. Now, some little sparks can have a pretty negative impact, and maybe that's the way we normally think of it. But this particular song that you get stuck in your head, this little earworm, as it is, gets stuck in your head saying, imagination, a dream can be a dream that comes true with just this little spark, he says. So, can a little spark have a good result? Well, sure. And so sometimes it just depends on what we're talking about in that regard. So, the point of me bringing that up tonight is obviously we're talking about the tongue. In this class, we're talking about the power of the tongue. We've kind of centered in at least one key verse we've been using in this class is Proverbs 18:21, where it says that death and life are in the power of the tongue. And sometimes it's just a little spark. Sometimes it's just a little thing that can create something good, or a little thing that can create something not so good. And so that's what I want us to think about tonight. We spent the first class talking about the life, the power of life in the tongue. And I don't want this class isn't going to be completely negative. I don't want you to think about that. I don't want you to think that. But we're going to focus on this idea of death being in the power of the tongue tonight. But here's where I want to start. I want to start with little things that have a big impact. And I want you to think, all right, what kind of little things have a big impact? How about when you stub your little toe? Is your little toe pretty little? I mean, that's why you call it your little toe. There's a difference between your big toe and your little toe, right? So your little toe is little. Is it a big deal when your little toe gets stubbed? Yeah, I mean, it's like the only thing that matters. Okay, the world comes to a stop, and everybody needs to be concerned about you and your little toe. So little thing can have a pretty big impact. What about a crying baby? I mean, they're just so little, right? They're the smallest people in the room, and they're just so little and cute. But when that baby starts crying, can a little thing have a big impact? I mean, all of a sudden, whatever you were doing, all right, we're going to stop. We're going to call a timeout. We're going to go figure out this little baby controls the world, doesn't even know, well, maybe he knows it, doesn't even know it yet. Little baby, big impact. Maybe this will speak to some of you. What about a spider in the house? Or a cockroach, depending on which flavor you go for here. Little thing, some of you are like, not so little. Little thing, big impact? Maybe big impact literally, depending on what you hit it with. But it's just something small. All right, so what other little things can you think of in life that have a big impact? Anything else you want to add to the list? A nail in your tire. Those are rough days, right? Little thing, big impact. Say again? Did you say jalapeno? Okay. Especially the seeds in the little jalapeno can have a big impact. Somewhere, you're speaking like from recent experience. Okay, so somewhere in your sandwich that you weren't expecting. Stephen's like, I'm still feeling it right this minute. Big impact. What else? Say again? Bed bugs. Ooh, yeah. Yep, little things. Boy, those things are horrible. You can't get rid of them. Eva? Oh, well, did you say crawling in your hair? I don't have that problem. Luther, cockroach crawling in your hair, you're like, keep going. It's no big deal, right? Some of you are getting kind of the willies right now. What do you got? A bee sting.
Or a shot in your arm, like when you get vaccine.
Ah, yeah, shot in your arm. Is that a little thing? The needle's kind of little, right? Big deal. Janice? Mosquitoes. Yep, we know about those, don't we? All right, so get your Bibles and go to James chapter 3. All right? We could definitely keep thinking of little things and big impacts. And you're thinking of some right now, maybe some that we shouldn't mention out loud. But go to James chapter 3. All right, when we say go to James chapter 3, there's certain chapters in the Bible that maybe as you hear it called out, something triggers in your head. All right? 1 Corinthians 13 ought to be something going off in your head. Hebrews 11, you think, all right, this is what this chapter's about. James chapter 3, what's this chapter about? It's about your tongue. All right? Now, he's going to spend, and it's not the whole chapter, he's going to focus on it really in the first 12 verses. But in order to help us to take this concept of little things, big impact, he talks about some little things in this chapter, and to put the whole thing into perspective, he talks about some little things in here. So look in verse 3. What is the little thing in verse 3 that he talks about? A bit in a horse's mouth. All right, so compared to a horse, is the bit kind of small? Yeah. That's pretty small. What's his point by bringing that up? A bit in a horse's mouth. What's the point?
It directs the horse.
Is that crazy? This little thing here, you can control. That's okay. What about verse 4? What's the small thing that has a big impact in verse 4? The rudder. All right, and in my Bible, it calls it a very small rudder on a large ship. And so here's a large ship that has a very small rudder. What's the deal there? Same concept. He says you've got this pilot, you have this individual steering the ship at the end of verse 4, and all he does is just redirect that rudder just slightly and changes the course. How is that? Huge ship, little rudder. It's interesting what God does here, isn't it? He's trying to get you to understand the impact of your tongue, and he's using. Are these still things that this is 2,000 years old, right? Is this still something that makes sense to us? Rudder in a horse's mouth. Yeah, that'd be fun. A bit in a horse's mouth. We've improved on that in 2,000 years, right? Do we still put bits in horses' mouths? Isn't that interesting? Do ships still have rudders on them today? You think God knew that those would be timeless illustrations to put in the Bible? All right, verse 5. The end of verse 5 is what I want you to focus on, where he talks about a spark that can cause a great forest. How great a forest a little fire kindles. It's almost like an annual thing, isn't it? Or at least every other year, every few years, we're watching these wildfires out west. How do those start? Little spark. I mean, it doesn't have to be much, and all of a sudden you got major devastation. So again, a timeless illustration that we see on a regular basis. So his point in bringing up those three illustrations is to talk about the beginning of verse 5, that the tongue is a little member. Little member. What does that mean? Well, compared to the rest of your body. Compared to the rest of your body. How big's your tongue? I mean, I didn't ask you how big's your mouth, all right? Some of you, we're not going there, all right, but we're talking physical size, okay? Again, it's an illustration that carries today. It's a little member, and yet, what does he say? It boasts great things. What kind of things does our tongue affect? Relationships. Yep, affects relationships. What kind of things, what great things, here's a little member that has great impact. What kind of things does it affect? Look in verse 2. For we all stumble in many things. We all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man. We're going to come back and talk about this verse in a minute. Able also to bridle the whole body. What's the point? Your whole body is affected by your little tongue. And we talked about the little toe. Yeah, the little toe has an impact on the whole body too. What about verse 6? Tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. We'll come back and talk about that. The tongue is so set among our members, it defiles the whole body. There it is again. And sets on fire here's the New King James wording, sets on fire the course of nature. You have something different in your Bible than it sets on fire the course of nature? Say it again, Julie. The entire course of life. Your tongue sets on fire, it affects the entire course of life. It affects your spiritual walk. That's what he's talking about in verse 2 when he talks about stumbling. Go back to chapter 1. This is not the first time we're reading about the tongue in this book. Go back to chapter 1, verse 26. Our tongue affects our relationship with God. It affects our acceptance in the eyes of God. Verse 26 of chapter 1, if anyone thinks he is religious, but he doesn't bridle his tongue, but he deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless. You can be a really good Christian, but if you don't bridle your tongue, not acceptable in the eyes of God. It makes your religion in the eyes of God. That verse hits me every time I read it. I mean, that's one of those verses that God's not pulling any punches. He's like, you got to understand the impact. What does it mean to bridle your tongue then?
Keep it under control.
Okay. What do you do with that horse when you bridle that horse? It's keeping it under control. So what you need to do is you need to walk around with a bit. You need to walk around with a bit in your mouth, right? You're like, well, it might help. I wouldn't be able to talk if I had the bit in there, and it might help me to do better. We've got to learn to bridle. We've got to learn to bridle our tongue, because here is this little member of our body, and yet is there any other member of our body that gets us as in trouble as our tongue does? It gets us in a lot of, it ranks near the top, doesn't it? All right, so little things, big impact. So I want to talk about this little fire that we all have, all right? This little fire that we, what did we call it? Was it last week or the week before? We've got this weapon of mass destruction, this WMD that we're carrying around. We've got our concealed weapon, as it were, that we're carrying around. But the Bible says that, look in verse 5, the tongue is a little member. Verse 6 says the tongue is a fire. It's a little one. But like those wildfires we see, it can cause major, big devastation. So I want you to see and as I was going through this today, this list kept growing. How does it describe the tongue? Verse 2. It describes the tongue as a tripping hazard. For we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he's a perfect man. We're going to come back and talk about that. Able also to bridle the whole body. What does it mean to stumble in word? What does it mean that the tongue is a tripping hazard? How do you stumble over your tongue? I mean, God put it up here and in here so that you wouldn't trip over it, right? Okay. So it's when we open mouth and insert foot that's where we do some stumbling. Anger, all right, which gets expressed often with our tongue. And do we stumble over that? Dirk, are you raising your hand? Idle words. Jesus talks about those in Matthew 12, doesn't he? Those will get us into trouble. Sherilyn? Okay. So not only would we ourselves stumble over our words, but our words can be a stumbling block to others. So they're tripping hazards. We've already noticed that they are a turning influence, like the bit in the horse's mouth, like the rudder on a ship. He uses those two illustrations not only to say something small has a big impact, that's true, but both of those are steering mechanisms. Is our tongue a steering mechanism?
If it's steered in the right way.
Okay. Can we steer others with our tongue? Well, yeah. Can we steer them in a good direction? Can we steer them in a not so good direction? And so when you read that, and I think it's at least twice, when he talks about the bit in the horse's mouth, we turn their whole body. And when he talks about the rudder on the ship, he uses, they are turned by a very, so you got the word turn in verse 3 and the word turn in verse 4. Talk about, here's something that's controlling this, it's directing it. Well, our tongue do that. Verse 6, the tongue is a fire. New King James says, a world of iniquity. Anybody have a different word than iniquity? Maybe unrighteousness in some Bibles? World of evil. That concept there is, you just get everything entangled. Everything gets tangled up here in a web of evil. And our tongue is that little member, that fire, that can create that tangle of wrongdoing in our lives. Look in verse 8. No man can tame the tongue. Going to come back and talk about that. I keep saying that, right? Going to come back. No man can, we're going to talk about that. It is, New King James says, it is an unruly evil. What do you think about when you think about unruly? You think about your 3-year-old daughter's hair being unruly. What do you think about unruly? Not controlled? Did you say blabbermouth? Is that what you... an unruly evil. The word for unruly here, it really means something that's unstable. You ever been standing on something, sitting on something that you didn't feel was really stable? That's the word so it's, your tongue is an unstable or a turbulent evil. You ever been on a plane when there's turbulence? That's fun, isn't it? There's a bit of uncertainty, a bit of fright perhaps. That there's this turbulence, but what kind of it's a turbulent evil. I mean, think about how descriptive God. Now, the rest of verse 8, not only an unruly evil, New King James at the end of verse 8 says, Is God making this easier? It is full of deadly poison. Oh, that's all. And it's in your mouth. I mean, that's where you want poison, is in your mouth, right? So here's a toxic poison. It's a poison to us. It can become a poison to others. Go back up to verse 6. Defiles the whole body. It sets on fire the course of nature. Here is a fire that is just absolutely troublesome. And what sets it, look at the end of verse 6. What sets it on fire? Set on fire by heaven? That's where it's set on fire, right? Wow. I mean, how many ways does God have to describe our tongue to get our attention? Here is our tongue. It's trained by hell. And yet all of these, what is that? 7 things? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Here's 7 things, and yet it still says it's just tiny. Just tiny. How can something so tiny be a tripping hazard, a turning influence, a tangle of wrongdoing, a turbulent evil, a toxic poison, a troublesome fire, and to be trained by hell? That sounds like something we'd better have a good fix on, a good control on. Darren, you can say something?
Yeah, in Matthew 12, Jesus kind of gives the synopsis for where all that stuff comes from. It's out of the abundance of the heart, whether it's good or evil.
Right.
It's the thing by which you either bless or condemn. Just as easily, I mean, how many times we say, just as easily bless them and curse them at the same time.
Right.
How is the control? Where does the control come from?
Right. And that's the key, is learning how to control. Now, if you walk up to a wild horse, you say, "Here, put a bit in its mouth." So you under control now? Great. We put a bit in its mouth. This is going to be easy. Yes? No? Is that not the way it works? Now, the bit is a tool. But what is going to be required here? Training, time, effort, diligence, over and over, right? And cooperation. So with our tongue, is it the same thing? Is it going to, if we want to harness our tongue, if we want to put a muzzle over our mouth, as it were, is that something we can easily do overnight, quickly do overnight? Or does that take some time, effort, training? And we're going to talk about that, and we're especially going to talk about that a lot next week as we wrap things up. But is that, think about that description. Does that overwhelm you? I mean, the more I went through it this afternoon, I'm like, okay, there's nothing, and it's just time and time again, God says, I want you to know the seriousness of this subject. Now, what can this little member that has this kind of power, what kind of devastation? What kind of devastation can this fire cause? First of all, it causes harm to the ones who are on the receiving end of the fire. Is that true? If our tongue's a fire, there's some people that are on the receiving end of it. And this grabs a little bit a hold of the verse that Darren was mentioning. Look down at verse 9. With it we bless our God and Father, and with it we do what? Curse men. That's not very nice, is it? With it we curse men. The word that's used for curse there means that I am praying against somebody. We may not think that very often. I mean, that's what the word means. We just spent time a little while ago praying for people. That's a good thing to do, right? Did you know you can pray against some? And you're like, yep, I knew it. I do it. No, don't do it. The word means I'm wishing them ill. I'm wishing them evil. And it's not just a wish. It's not just a prayer. It's something I'm actually verbalizing. Wow. As Darren mentioned, and we're going to look more at it next week, that first comes, what comes from our tongue first comes from our heart. But what happens if that cursing of somebody, that praying against, what happens when it comes from our tongue? Not just in our heart, but now it's coming out of our mouth. What does that indicate? Okay, it's going to hurt them. We've become a whole lot more comfortable with that thought. I mean, because usually those kind of thoughts, we'll just keep them inside. We don't want anybody to know about that. But when we're comfortable enough for that to escape the tongue, all of a sudden, we're at a point of ease with that kind of a heart and that kind of a mindset. Cheryl Ann? Right. Yeah. Well, right. And Cheryl Ann, she talks about how the Bible says in 1 Peter 5 that the devil is seeking to devour us, and then says even with our own tongue, sometimes we seek to devour people. And that's stated in Galatians chapter 5. Galatians chapter 5 talks about how we bite and devour one another. And that happens with how we treat each other, how we talk to each other. I want you to think about the book of James for just a minute. And I found this interesting as I was thinking through this, because we could go outside the book of James, and I'm going to run over the book of Proverbs here in just a little bit. But I want you to think about the book of James, and I want you to think about this concept of how our tongues burn the one on the receiving end of things that we say. I want you to think about things in the book of James about how we do that. In James chapter 2, you've got the last 13 verses, because that talks about faith and works. But the first 13 verses talks about partiality. It talks about how partiality must not be a part of the Christian life. He who shows partiality does sin, verse 9 says. But can we express partiality with our tongues? With how we talk to somebody? With names that we call somebody's? With expressions we might use that come off of our tongue? Partiality is something that it starts in the heart, it comes out in our actions, but it's also something that is done with our tongue. What does a Christian need to do? He needs to guard that tongue and not let anything come out of his mouth that would be perceived as someone who's prejudiced, someone who is partial in any way. Go over to chapter 4, verse 11. We're going to look in chapter 4 and chapter 5. A couple other things that specifically are talking about the tongue. Look in chapter 4, verse 11. Do not speak evil of one another. Speaking evil of one another. Now, that's different. Let me ask you, maybe I'll ask you a question. Is speaking evil of somebody different than speaking evil to somebody? Is that different? What's the difference? If I speak evil to somebody, all right, they are on the direct receiving end of my burning fire tongue. But if I speak evil of somebody, what does that indicate? Yeah, they may not even be in the room. They may not even be in the state. I'm just going to talk about them. I'm going to speak evil of them. And does God give any wiggle room in chapter 4 and verse 11? Any let me slide there at all? No. And so here's a word that's talking about slander. Here's a word that's talking about gossip. And God says that doesn't need to have a part of your speech. Not just be careful what you say directly to somebody. You need to stop saying things of other people. Look in chapter 5 for another one. This is a little bit different of a concept. So don't speak evil, to each other, of each other. Chapter 5, verse 9. Do not grumble against one another. Okay. What's that? Can you roll your eyes? Okay. Well, we're going to have a short course on the power of our eyes, Allison, next, after power of the tongue. So I didn't say anything. Your kids ever try to pull that? I didn't say anything, Mom. Well, your tongue may not have verbalized anything, but your face was screaming it loud and clear. Message received. Do not grumble. Do not complain against one another. Now, Philippians 2:14 says, do all things without complaining. That's one verse. But this one's talking about against one another.
David, who is he talking to? Who's his brother?
He's talking to Christians. He's talking to Christians grumbling about other Christians. But they wouldn't do that because Christians don't grumble about other Christians. So I mean, it's just hypothetical.
He didn't write this to a particular.
Well, it's addressed in chapter 1, verse 1 to those, he says, who are the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. And some have tried to make that a Jewish element. Obviously, there is a Jewish element there from a background standpoint. The book of James is believed to be the first New Testament book written. And so it was being written shortly after the Christians were being scattered abroad in various places. And so it is not being addressed. If you're asking, is it written like to the church at Ephesus or the church at Corinth? It's not addressed in that way. It's in the section of the New Testament that we often call the general epistles. You got the New Testament, you got the gospel accounts, you got the book of history, Acts. You have Paul's epistles from Romans down through Philemon, and then you get the general epistles, and that's James, 1st, 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Jude, which are more of a general audience rather than a specific audience. But the specific audience is us. It's Christians. And so he's saying to Christians, do not grumble or groan or complain. So what's that? That involves my tongue, because can that be harmful? If I complain about the elders, can that be harmful? If I complain about the whoever in the church, can that be harmful? Yeah. Who likes to be complained about? Who likes to have grumbling? Now, let me throw some Proverbs up here real quick. Rash words. That's not talking about something on your arm like a red bubble thing. Rash words are like sword thrusts. Can those hurt? A harsh word stirs up anger. A biting tongue. A biting tongue. Yeah, backbiting tongue, brings an angry countenance. You talk about somebody behind their back, and what's their face going to do? It's going to be angry at you. Perverseness in the tongue crushes the spirit. Here's something I was thinking about as I was reading these verses today. Whose spirit is that talking about in Proverbs 15, verse 4? Perverseness in the tongue crushes the spirit. Is that talking about your own spirit? Or is that talking about the other person's spirit? The application is both. I think primary is talking about the other person's spirit, but perverseness in your tongue can crush your own spirit. Lying tongue hates those it crushes. Flattering mouth works ruin. Proverbs 17:9, he who repeats a matter, what's that? Gossip. Separates close friends. So here we have what James calls a toxic poison. Can it hurt? Julie, did you talk about our relationships? Is that who said relationships a minute ago? This toxic poison. How many marriages have been negatively impacted by words? How many homes on an ongoing basis are troubled, maybe not by physical violence, maybe not by financial troubles, troubled by words in the home. And not just words, but we could go back and talk about tone involved in that. So when we think about death being in the power of the tongue, when we think about this little fire that we have in the big devastations, first of all, there are those who are on the receiving end. Boy, they get it. But the thing about fire is, it's not going to only hurt the person on the receiving end. What are you doing with it? You're handling it. It's going to hurt you too. Think about these proverbs. One who opens wide his lips comes to ruin. A fool's mouth is his destruction. He just opens his mouth, and a fool's mouth is his destruction. Whoever secretly slanders, gossips his neighbor, God says, him I will destroy. Proverbs 11:12, whoever belittles his neighbor lacks sense. That's a nice kind of benign way to say that, isn't it? You can think of more colorful ways, perhaps, to say that. You belittle your neighbor, and what does God think of you? You're not very smart for a number of reasons. He who, and I put that on this list of that burns on the one on the giving end, because what's somebody likely going to do to you if you belittle them? Could you be on the receiving end yourself of something? He who has a perverse tongue, no big deal. Think about this. God says he falls into evil. He who guards his mouth and his tongue guards his soul from troubles. Have you ever seen that to be true? If I guard my tongue, if I just shut up, I keep myself out of trouble. In the verse that Dirk mentioned a little while ago, every idle word men may speak, they will give account of it on the day of judgment. So, we're getting ready to go into, all right, what are some things that I can do to deal with this? But does he reinforce like exponentially Proverbs 18:21? Is death in the power of the tongue? Sometimes you read a verse and you think, well, maybe sometimes you read a verse and maybe you think, boy, that's overstating it. Death is in the power of is God overstating it? Is it an exaggerate? Do you ever exaggerate to your kids to get across a point? Don't shake your head, especially if they're sitting right next to you. But do you ever exaggerate a point to your kids to maybe prove a point? Perhaps. God's not exaggerating the point. There is major devastation that's caused by what we say. So, all right, so what do we got? 5 minutes? Little changes, big difference. So come back to James 3, okay? And here's the verses I said we were going to come back to and talk about. Because there's a couple places in James chapter 3 that kind of maybe make you question. Look at verse 8. No man can tame the tongue. Good, cool. All right, so nobody can tame the tongue, so you can't, I can't. Good deal. Then I don't need to try, right? That's why God puts that line in there. No man can tame the tongue. So he's saying to you, don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. Is that what he's saying? If that's what he's saying, why do you have the rest of the chapter? Why do you have anything else said about the tongue if he's just going to say, hey, nobody can tame it, so don't worry about it? Why do you have all those verses in the book of Proverbs? That's not what he's saying. It's not saying that you don't have to. But in my Bible, and I don't know if I do have it underscored or not, but at least in my mind, the emphasis there is on the man or the woman, the person. The person can't tame the tongue. Can God? Think God can? I mean, put this in, take it for 1 second out of the context of the tongue. What about the rest of our passions? What about the rest of our desires? Can I have sinful desires that if I say, oh, well, you know, I was in college with a guy that came down. He didn't come down with me. He came down with his friends to Florida during spring break, and he was telling his buddies, you know what? If I don't look at the girls, I'm just going to die. So I've got to look at them. And he wasn't at all interested in curbing his lust. He said, you know, if I don't look, I'm going to die. What is that? Is that just saying, I'm not going to control these desires? If God says I have these passions, these desires, these lusts, but He expects me to control them, well, what about my tongue? Does He expect me to? So real quick, we only have a couple minutes here. Tame the tongue. Here's the other verse here, and I put these together because in verse 2, if anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man. And so some people go to that and say, look, see, I'm stumbling, and it's because I'm not perfect. Okay, yes, that's true. That is a true statement. But why does he say, if you don't stumble in word, if anyone does not stumble, why does he use the word perfect? And I think sometimes we maybe misunderstand and misuse the word perfect. And so we have no time, do we? Look at how many times the word perfect is just in the book of James. Context. If anyone does not stumble in word, he's a perfect man. What does this mean? That patience have its perfect work. Okay? So I've got to learn to be a patient person. I've got to learn to deal with the trials of life. Every perfect gift is from above. Look into the perfect law of liberty. What does all of that mean? My point here is, can God help me to control my tongue? How can He help me? When I pick up my Bible, the Bible is able to make me perfect or complete. I pick up God's Word, I put God's Word into my heart, and Ephesians 6 and verse 10 says that with God's help, I can overcome. Let me throw a couple more things at you real quick. Number 2, remember that you belong to Jesus. Okay? Did Jesus control His tongue? Yeah. He was reviled, but He did not revile in return. God says if there's blessing and cursing coming out of the same opening, it ought not to be so. What does that mean when He says it ought not to be so? It means I got to learn to control it. Don't feed the fire. Keep your mouth shut. And there's all sorts of verses, and I wish we had time. But again, in this same book of James, what does he say? Let every man be quick to hear. Well, what if I can't control my... If God says you can be slow to speak, you can be slow to speak. He doesn't tell us to do something that we cannot do. I love the verse in Proverbs 26:20. For lack of wood, the fire goes out. When you run out of wood, what happens to the fire? Okay? You be the one that stops the fire. You be the one that says, stops with me, no more wood. I'm not, and that's kind of the last point too, is when somebody comes to talk to you, says, have you heard about so-and-so? You can say, nope, and I don't want to. Not coming to me. Stops there. Because Proverbs chapter 26, he who passes by and meddles in a quarrel that is not his own is like somebody who takes a dog by his ears. That's pretty dumb, isn't it? Take a dog by its ears. Yeah. And if you're going to get involved in something that's not your business, which is what 1 Peter 4 and verse 15 is talking about, being a busybody in other people's matters, stay out of it. And obviously that's in a very specific corner of controlling our tongue. But as usual, I've got way too much information trying to feed you out of a fire hose tonight. What's the point of all of this? Can I control my tongue? Yeah, with God's help. I can't do it on my own, but I can't overcome any of my lustful passions on my own, not successfully. Got to do it with God's help. And with God's help, I can learn to control it. All right, so next week we're going to talk about that the heart is the power of the tongue, and if we're going to control the tongue, then we're going to control our heart. So it's going to be a very positive lesson next week. All right, thank you all very much for the extra 2 minutes tonight.